good afternoon to everyone from Apia. And thank you very much, Ishkab, for allowing me to be part and contribute to today's discussion. Also, it has been a pleasure to collaborate and co-organize this webinar with you during the past months. And of course, it's an honor to be part of this distinguished list of panelists and speakers. I believe that this is a fantastic opportunity to talk about intangible cultural heritage beyond the limits of the convention and acknowledge the importance of living heritage to communities, but also its role when addressing broader global issues such as climate change and food security. I will be mentioning such issues later on in my presentation. I have prepared a very simple, aesthetically simple presentation, but I believe that what I'm trying to convey as messages are information that I received through my very few months working with the Apia office and in the Pacific. As you mentioned, Minji, I just arrived and it took a very long time due to the current circumstances to bring me to Apia. What really introduced me to the situation in the Pacific, specifically in relation to the COVID crisis, was the involvement of UNESCO with the joint UN exercise on the socioeconomic impact assessment of COVID-19 in the Pacific. And this assessment is broadly based on the 5 pillars of the UN framework for the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID. But from UNESCO's perspective, what we looked at was mainly the 5th pillar, and that is the social dimension of the impact. And in addition to that, what I tried to do was to look at this, the social impact, through a cultural lens. As you know, in the Pacific, communities follow formal but also traditional governance systems, and COVID affected perhaps not so much with the healthcare system, as there were very few cases in some of the countries, but it affected people's lives through the access of goods, services, and support. And this had a social, economic, and cultural impact. The aim of UNESCO in this assessment was to provide qualitative and quantitative diagnostics on the impact of COVID, both on social cohesion, but also on community well-being and resilience. We also looked at how to identify post-pandemic recovery needs to ensure social inclusion through cultural participation, and also to strengthen the cultural and the creative actors and sectors of the Pacific. So what we did was defining these terms. For social cohesion, we defined it as a sense of collective identity and belonging, mutual support, social networks, safe spaces, as well as local heritage, tolerance to difference, and cultural diversity. And both individuals, community, and institutions play a role in fostering social cohesion. In terms of the community resilience, we defined it as the ability of community to overcome, recover from, and adapt to disruptive events such as disasters, climate change, and so on. But obviously also COVID is such an event. They do this, communities do this through using their collective resources, which are human, cultural, political, and so on. When we were defining the methodology for this process, we definitely took into account the UN Declaration of Human Rights, specifically the Article 22, which refers to cultural rights, but also Article 27, which is related to free participation in cultural life. We also took into account the UNESCO 2030 cultural indicators, And the questionnaire that we developed, we circulated it and received inputs from different sections and units of headquarters, specifically related to our discussion today, the Living Heritage Unit of UNESCO. So what you see on this slide on the bottom part is a part of the questionnaire. What we tried to do through the questionnaire was looking into both social cohesion, but also the impact of COVID on institutions that are involved, and our main stakeholders play an important role in safeguarding and protecting heritage, but also assessing the impact of cultural employment. So the impact of COVID on the creative industries, on people's livelihoods that are related to the cultural sector. And the data was collected from a very diverse sources, which included, I mean, definitely newspapers, social media, but mainly surveys that were done face-to-face. And I think this is what differentiated it from other surveys that were done at the same time. We worked for quite a long time on this, from May to September, but we covered all 15 Pacific SIDS, and the result is a very bulky selection of reports, but at the moment we are actually working on a more user-friendly and engaging version of it, which will be in the form of a policy brief and infographics with a country-specific focus. In the Pacific context, where social and cultural participation and inclusion, sense of belonging are underpinned by the maintenance of relationships within families and communities, and they are activated through life cycle events, which were obviously impacted by COVID and the different restrictions. There is a sense of place and access to places of cultural importance. And there is a need to feel the ability to share and participate in life, in events, and access to gardens, land, and sea, which is actually demonstrating the intimate and embodied relationship with environment. Many of these elements sits at the heart of cohesion and act as safety nets. So we saw similar trends throughout our surveys in the different countries. So in the bullet points are some main conclusions that we drew, and that is that in the Pacific SIDS, there was strengthening of social cohesion as families and communities came together during the restrictions and lockdown, and they, in a sense, renewed their bonds. There was definitely a return to rural areas, specifically for people that lost their jobs or had limited or reduced hours. We also saw how social and cultural participation are essential to the Pacific well-being and form the backbone of kinship and kinship relations. And this is seen in the emergence of stories of families and communities that started building on self-sufficiency and therefore started turning to agriculture or traditional food production, but also the solidarity economy that we saw in the Pacific in terms of the revival of the bartering system. The picture you see on this slide is actually from the response or part of a response from Palau. And the interesting thing with the survey was that many countries actually identified positive aspects to COVID. So for example, in Palau, there was the importance given and and value given to elders and the recognition of their role in transmission of living heritage even by the Ministry of Community and Cultural Affairs. And what they did was during the lockdown, they established an internet service that was called Meet and Greet, and they would do this once a week, where elders would have the opportunity to pass on information to younger people in the community. Or, for example, in Fiji, there was a revitalization of the Sole Solevaki practice. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but this is basically means, or loose translation of it means that people working together towards a common aim. And so this practice was revitalized, and there was a return to traditional lands, in some cases led by youth, and who were returning to villages, and they were farming collectively and providing support to families that were in need. There are a lot of examples through this survey that I can bring up. I've just put a few responses on this slide. I can also mention a few others. In Kiribati, for example, there were traditional communal events such as rethatching of village, Maneaba, that continued, and elders and chiefs have been involved in decision making as was their norm. Some communities have also taken the time to reorganize themselves and to be less dependent on tourism, because the main impact has been the economic impact on the tourism industry, and also being less dependent on the cash economy. So as I mentioned earlier, the bartering system has been on a rise, and we've seen samples of this using Facebook or other social media platforms to do bartering. I would like to close with a reflection on how all this data and information collected can be channeled to support innovative investment and ensuring that communities are at the center of the recovery efforts. This is definitely an opportunity to build back better, to take the opportunity of the positive aspects that we have seen and try to support them in future activities. As I mentioned earlier, one way of doing that from our side, from UNESCO Apia, is making this data available, making it available for decision makers and for people that are in place to support and really ensure that communities are at the center of the recovery efforts. But I believe that in the discussion today, in a way, I'm preaching to the converted, because we all know and we all believe in the transversal importance and contribution of intangible cultural heritage to development. And we are aware of how knowledge and practices are transmitted from generation to generation in areas such as agriculture and food systems and traditional medicine, natural resource management, and ecosystem services. And all this contributes to various SDGs, such as food security, SDG 2, or SDG 3 climate change, or SDG 13 healthcare, or gender equality, or decent work. And so what is now required from us is to advocate for the importance of ICH beyond the limits of the convention and the culture sphere, because we can see the important contribution it has throughout the development goals. So with that, I would just like to thank you, and I look forward to the discussions that are to follow. Thank you very much.